10 August 1944. At 0600 hours, the Situation Room of Army Group B was already warm with bodies and stale air. The overnight temperature had not dropped below 20 degrees Celsius, and the windows remained closed by order. Cigarette smoke clung to the lamps above the central map table, blurring the red and blue grease pencil lines that defined the Western Front. Intelligence charts prepared during the night showed no significant deviation from the previous day's estimate. The U.S. Third Army, under Patton, was assessed to be oriented east, its armored formations refitting after earlier advances. The map pins marking American armor remained clustered far from the German southern flank. No staff officer challenged their placement. The intelligence summary, read aloud at 0615, drew heavily from intercepted radio traffic and aerial reconnaissance conducted 48 hours earlier. The signals section rated the intercepts as high confidence, though the traffic itself was sparse and unusually disciplined. Reconnaissance aircraft had reported little movement on major roads. The absence of evidence was interpreted as confirmation. A junior officer from the intelligence branch noted cautiously that cloud cover had limited visual confirmation in several sectors. His remark was acknowledged with a nod, but not recorded in the logbook. At 0700 hours, the Chief of Staff initialed the morning situation report and forwarded it to higher command. The language was precise and reassuring. Enemy activity was described as methodical and bounded by logistical constraints. The phrase was underlined twice. It matched what command expected to see. After weeks of retreat, any sign of enemy hesitation was seized upon as proof that German defensive measures were beginning to impose friction. The idea that the enemy might be deliberately silent did not survive discussion. By 0730, attention shifted to the northern sectors, where British and Canadian forces continued to apply pressure along known axes. Reports of artillery fire and limited probing attacks occupied the bulk of the briefing. The southern flank, stretching along secondary roads and thinly held villages, was mentioned only in passing. A single infantry regiment, under strength and short of transport, was listed as screening the area. Its radio contact had been intermittent since the previous evening, but this was attributed to equipment failure. No request for reinforcement was raised. At 0815, a new set of maps was rotated onto the table. These were operational planning charts prepared 3 days earlier, showing expected enemy avenues of advance based on terrain analysis and prior behavior. The roads leading toward Avranches were marked as low probability due to their poor condition and the presumed exhaustion of enemy armored units. The pins remained static. The act of rotating the maps reinforced the sense that the battlefield itself was fixed, waiting to be acted upon rather than actively changing. The first hint of dissonance arrived at 0905. A field report from a Corps-level headquarters on the southern sector noted increased civilian movement westward along minor roads. The report carried a reliability code of C, indicating second-hand information. It was read, then set aside. Civilian movement had increased everywhere since the breakout. The operations officer remarked that refugees often moved ahead of Allied forces, not with them. The assumption went unchallenged. At 0930, fuel status was reviewed. Panzer units assigned to Mobile Reserve reported holdings sufficient for no more than 80 kilometers of movement. Ammunition stocks were similarly constrained. These figures were used to justify a defensive posture and to reinforce the belief that the enemy, facing similar constraints, would be unable to execute rapid maneuvers. The logic was circular but comforting. The notion that the enemy might accept risk in logistics to gain operational surprise was not seriously entertained. By mid-morning, the command atmosphere had settled into routine. Telephones rang, messages were logged, and coffee cups were refilled. The war, at least on the map, appeared orderly.
At 10:45, a liaison officer from a neighboring formation mentioned hearing rumors of American armor moving at night without lights. The comment was met with skepticism. Night movement of that scale was considered impractical given road conditions and fuel shortages. The rumor was not passed upward. At 11:30, the first direct report from the screening regiment on the southern flank arrived. The message was fragmented, transmitted in bursts through static. It reported engine noise during the early morning hours and brief contact with unidentified armored vehicles near a road junction previously assessed as impassable. The report's reliability was downgraded due to poor signal quality. The operations officer annotated the log with a question mark. No immediate action was taken. Lunch was taken in shifts. By 12:30, the Situation Room was quieter, though the maps remained lit. Outside, the heat intensified. Inside, the sense of control persisted. The intelligence officer updated the enemy estimate, noting no confirmed deviations. The earlier report was mentioned, but framed as an anomaly. The phrase "likely reconnaissance elements" was used. The assumption held that any major enemy movement would have been detected earlier. At 13:15, a second message arrived from the same regiment, this time reporting loss of contact with 2 forward platoons. The message included grid references that did not align neatly with existing overlays. A staff officer attempted to reconcile the coordinates, suggesting a transcription error. The possibility that the map itself was outdated was not raised. The report was forwarded to Corps headquarters with a note requesting clarification. By 1400, air reconnaissance reports from the morning sorties were reviewed. Photographs showed dust plumes along several secondary roads, but the analysts attributed these to civilian traffic or routine supply movement. The absence of clear armored silhouettes was taken as confirmation that no major units were present. The analysts did not note that the photographs were taken hours earlier and under suboptimal lighting conditions. At 1500, the Chief of Staff convened a brief meeting to review reserve dispositions. The mobile reserve remained positioned north of the presumed threat axis. Redeployment was discussed, but ultimately deferred. Moving the reserve would require fuel and expose it to air attack. More importantly, it would signal doubt in the existing assessment. The decision was recorded as no change. The first clear warning came at 1610. A Corps headquarters reported contact with American armor south of its expected zone. The report was flagged as urgent. The units involved were identified tentatively as elements of an armored division previously believed to be refitting. The intelligence officer requested confirmation. Until confirmed, the report was treated as provisional. The delay was procedural, but its effect was decisive. By 1700, additional reports corroborated the initial contact. Communications from the screening regiment ceased entirely. The operations map was adjusted slightly. A pin moved a few centimeters. The gesture was symbolic rather than corrective. The scale of the map masked the speed of the enemy movement. What appeared as a minor adjustment represented kilometers of advance. At 1835, the Chief of Staff authorized a limited probe by available reserves to clarify the situation. The order was cautious, framed as reconnaissance rather than counteraction. Fuel constraints delayed execution. The reserve units would not be able to move until nightfall. The window for immediate response closed quietly. By 1830, reports indicated that American armor had bypassed several defensive positions without engaging, moving rapidly along roads previously deemed unsuitable. The pattern did not fit established models. Staff officers exchanged glances, but said little. The intelligence charts were now visibly out of alignment with reality, yet the charts remained on the table. At 1900, the commanding general was briefed. He listened without interruption, then asked a single question. "How certain are we?" The answer was measured and incomplete. Certainty, it was said, was still developing. The general nodded and returned to his office. No new orders were issued. As night fell, the flank remained thin. The illusion of control persisted, sustained by procedure and habit. The maps still aligned nicely with expectations, even as the ground they represented was already changing hands. The decision not to act, recorded in neat handwriting, would shape the hours to come. 11 August 1944. At 00:30 a.m., the first calls came into Army Group B headquarters from a regimental switchboard on the southern sector. The voice on the line was strained, clipped by static, reporting armored movement on a secondary road long classified as unsuitable for tracked vehicles. The duty officer requested grid coordinates twice, suspecting a misread map reference. When the coordinates were repeated, they did not correspond to any recognized axis of advance. The call was logged as a probable navigation error and routed to intelligence for review. By 01:05, a second report arrived from a separate unit 20 kilometers to the east, describing the same phenomenon: tanks moving in column, engines throttled low, lights blacked out. The reporting officer identified the vehicles by sound and silhouette, noting wide tracks and turret profiles consistent with American medium armor. The reliability code was B, but the operations officer hesitated. Two identical errors arriving independently challenged procedure. The map pins did not move. At 02:14 a.m., a forward artillery battery ceased communications mid-transmission. The last fragment mentioned contact at close range and the loss of telephone lines. The Signal Corps attempted to re-establish contact using alternate frequencies, without success. The silence was noted, but the assumption remained that the battery had displaced under pressure. No one yet articulated the possibility that the pressure was coming from the wrong direction. At 02:15 a.m., a Corps headquarters transmitted an urgent situation report. American armor had crossed a road junction previously assessed as non-viable due to soft ground and narrow bridges. The report included visual confirmation from multiple observers. The operations map was adjusted again, this time with a cluster of pins. The adjustment still understated the scale.
The staff officer placing the pins paused, then added a penciled arrow indicating movement northward. It was the first acknowledgement that the enemy was not where doctrine said he should be. By 02:45, the intelligence officer requested updated aerial reconnaissance. The request was denied by the air liaison, citing darkness and limited aircraft availability. The absence of confirmation forced reliance on ground reports, a reversal of established hierarchy. The shift unsettled the staff. Ground reports were messy, contradictory, and personal. They carried fear in their phrasing. At 03:15, the first mention of a specific enemy formation appeared. A battalion commander reported contact with units identified as part of a U.S. armored division known for rapid exploitation. The identification was based on vehicle markings observed under fire. The intelligence officer cross-checked the division's last known location, still marked hundreds of kilometers away. The discrepancy was noted in red pencil. No explanation followed. By dawn, at 05:30, the situation room was crowded. Staff officers stood shoulder to shoulder around the map table. Coffee was abandoned untouched. Reports arrived faster than they could be logged. German infantry units reported being bypassed rather than engaged. Anti-tank guns were flanked before crews could bring them to bear. The patterns suggested deliberate speed, not probing. The enemy was not searching for weaknesses, he was exploiting them. At 06:10, the first request for permission to withdraw arrived from a regimental commander whose flanks were exposed and rear threatened. The request was forwarded up the chain with a recommendation for delay pending confirmation. The delay lasted 40 minutes. During that time, the regiment lost contact with 2 companies. When permission was finally granted, the withdrawal routes were already compromised. By 0700, fuel reports became critical. Units ordered to reposition found their transport columns cut off or destroyed. Ammunition resupply stalled as roads filled with refugees and retreating elements. The logistical assumptions underpinning the defensive plan collapsed under the speed of the enemy advance. The staff began to speak in terms of containment rather than control. At 0745, the commanding general entered the room. He listened as the operations officer summarized the situation in clipped sentences. The general asked for confirmation of enemy strength. The answer was uncertain. Estimates ranged from a reinforced division to an entire armored corps. The uncertainty itself was a consequence of speed. The enemy's pace denied the time needed for accurate assessment. At 0830, an attempt was made to establish a blocking line using available reserves. Orders were issued, then amended as new reports arrived. One reserve battalion reported encountering American armor en route to its assigned position. The order was countermanded. The battalion was told to disengage and fall back. The disengagement failed. By 0915, the battalion ceased reporting. At 0100, the first air reconnaissance photographs arrived. They showed columns of vehicles moving along roads previously dismissed as unusable. The photographs were time-stamped from early morning. The delay rendered them descriptive rather than actionable. The intelligence officer placed them on the table without comment. The images spoke for themselves. By midday, at 1200, the southern flank no longer existed as a coherent line. Units operated in isolation, reporting enemy contact from multiple directions. The term breakthrough appeared in the logbook for the first time. It was underlined once, then twice. The commanding general authorized emergency measures, including the release of reserves held for other sectors. The order carried risk elsewhere, but the alternative was collapse. At 1330, a message from higher command arrived demanding clarification and assurance. The reply was drafted carefully, acknowledging contact but downplaying scale. The language lagged behind reality. The need to maintain confidence upward conflicted with the need to act decisively downward. The staff felt the strain acutely. By 1500, American armor was reported crossing another key road junction, effectively severing lateral movement between German formations. The map was now crowded with arrows and annotations. The original neat lines were obscured. The staff officer responsible for the map wiped sweat from his hands before making further changes. The physical degradation of the map mirrored the erosion of the plan. At 1630, the commanding general issued an order to establish a new defensive line further north. The order was explicit and irreversible. Units were to disengage where possible and move immediately. The cost of delay was acknowledged but accepted. The order marked the abandonment of the original defensive concept. By evening, at 1900, reports indicated that American units continued to advance, exploiting gaps faster than German units could respond. The enemy's presence, once theoretical, was now undeniable. The assumptions that had governed the previous day lay in fragments across the map table. The army had not appeared from nowhere. It had moved faster than belief allowed. The consequence was immediate and measurable. Positions lost, units cut off, and authority diminished. The illusion of predictability was gone, replaced by the hard fact of an enemy dictating the tempo. 12 August 1944. At 0020, Army Group B headquarters abandoned the pretense of maintaining a continuous front. The night staff replaced the main operational map with a larger-scale regional chart, its edges extending beyond the prepared overlays. The original pins were removed and placed in a tray without ceremony. A new logbook was opened. The decision reflected an unspoken admission. The enemy's movement outpaced the tools used to track it. By 0100, reports arrived from 4 different corps headquarters,
each describing contact in locations that could not be reconciled into a single enemy axis. One report placed American armor near a river crossing still marked as secure. Another described infantry pressure on a rear area supply depot. A third mentioned radio intercepts suggesting enemy headquarters relocation, though the source was unverified. The intelligence officer attempted to classify the reports by reliability, but the volume overwhelmed the system. The classifications blurred. At 0315, the first internal dispute emerged openly. The operations officer argued that several reports must be duplicative or misidentified units. The intelligence officer countered that the consistency in timing suggested coordinated movement. A senior staff officer intervened, instructing both to simplify. The instruction had no practical effect. Simplification required certainty, and certainty was absent. At 0210, markers were moved again. Each adjustment lagged behind the latest reports by at least 30 minutes. The staff officer responsible for the map began annotating times next to each pin, an attempt to preserve sequence. The annotations quickly crowded the surface. The map ceased to function as a predictive tool and became a historical record already obsolete. By 0245, communications degraded further. Several field units reported interference and signal overlap, likely caused by enemy proximity and damaged infrastructure. Messages arrived truncated or out of order. The signals officer warned that relay stations south of the Loire were no longer reliable. The implication was that even accurate reports might not reach headquarters in time to matter. By 0315, the commanding general ordered a pause in map adjustments. He requested a verbal summary instead. The summary took 12 minutes and ended without a clear picture. Enemy strength estimates varied widely. Some officers spoke of a single armored thrust. Others described a rolling advance with multiple spearheads. The lack of agreement itself was evidence of lost coherence. At 0400, the first contradictory orders were issued. One corps was instructed to hold its ground to prevent encirclement of neighboring units. Minutes later, another order directed the same corps to disengage and move north to protect a threatened road junction. The corps commander requested clarification. The clarification arrived too late. The attempt to comply with both orders resulted in partial movement and exposed flanks. By dawn, at 0545, exhaustion was visible. Staff officers worked with jackets removed, collars open, eyes fixed on maps that no longer guided action. Coffee had lost its effect. The air was heavy, humid, and stagnant. The physical discomfort compounded cognitive strain. Decisions slowed not from caution, but from fatigue. At 0615, an updated enemy estimate was drafted and discarded. The draft acknowledged the possibility that American forces were operating beyond established command and control norms, accepting risk to maintain tempo. The phrasing was deemed speculative and removed. The final version reverted to cautious language. The gap between language and events widened. By 0700, reports indicated that at least 2 German divisions had lost lateral contact entirely. Their headquarters transmitted independently, each reporting enemy presence on multiple sides. Attempts to coordinate withdrawal routes failed as roads were already contested. The map showed overlapping arrows and blocked corridors. No clear path remained. At 0810, a heated exchange erupted between 2 senior officers regarding responsibility for the flank. One accused the other of ignoring early warnings. The accusation was deflected with procedural language. No resolution followed. The argument consumed valuable minutes and ended only when interrupted by another urgent report. The interpersonal tension lingered, unaddressed. At 0900, higher command requested an updated situation report. The request specified clarity and precision. The staff struggled to comply. The report, when sent, relied heavily on conditional phrasing. Words like likely, possibly, and unconfirmed dominated. The report satisfied form but conveyed little substance.
By 10:15, the first evidence of systemic breakdown appeared. A reserve unit, acting on outdated orders, advanced into an area already occupied by American armor. The unit suffered losses and withdrew in disarray. The incident was logged as a coordination failure. The term understated the cause. The failure was informational. At 1100 hours, the commanding general convened a brief conference. He asked each section head to state in one sentence what they believed to be the enemy's main effort. The sentences did not align. The divergence was stark. The general dismissed the conference without issuing new guidance. The absence of direction reflected the absence of a shared understanding. By midday, at 1200 hours, the operations room resembled a workshop rather than a command center. Maps were stacked against the walls. Tables were covered with notes, photographs, and message slips. The central map was scarred with erasures. The staff officer maintaining it paused frequently, unsure whether to adjust pins or wait for confirmation. Waiting carried its own cost. At 1330, a partial withdrawal order was issued to several formations simultaneously. The order lacked synchronization. Units began moving at different times and along different routes. Some encountered enemy forces immediately. Others found their routes blocked by friendly units retreating from elsewhere. The confusion generated additional reports, further cluttering the information flow. By 1430, the intelligence section acknowledged that its tracking methods had failed to keep pace with the enemy. The admission was internal and did not alter external reporting. The recognition came too late to restore coherence. The battlefield had fragmented into disconnected engagements. At 1530, a junior officer suggested abandoning map-based tracking in favor of sector-based reporting, focusing on loss of territory rather than precise positions. The suggestion was noted but not adopted. Changing methodology mid-crisis was deemed too risky. The irony was not lost on those present. By 1700, orders issued in the morning were no longer relevant. Units continued to request guidance that could not be provided with confidence. The chain of command remained intact in form, but hollow in function. Authority depended on information, and information was unreliable. At 1800, the commanding general authorized a consolidation north of the Seine, acknowledging that intermediate positions could not be held coherently. The order represented a strategic contraction forced by operational confusion. The cost was immediate: abandoned equipment, isolated units, and exposed rear areas. As evening approached, the maps lay flat but meaningless. They no longer represented a battlefield that could be controlled or even clearly described. The erosion of situational awareness had translated into irreversible loss of initiative. The battlefield did not merely defy understanding, it punished the attempt to impose it. 13 August 1944. At 0915 hours, the situation briefing began at the Führer headquarters with the reading of a summary already known to be incomplete. The conference room was sealed, its heavy doors closed against the summer heat. The maps on the wall were smaller than those used at the front, simplified for presentation, their clarity dependent entirely on the accuracy of reports filtered upward. Hitler listened without interruption as the operations officer outlined the southern situation in cautious terms. The language was measured, hedged, and behind the pace of events. At 0932, Hitler interrupted. He asked where the enemy's main armored forces were located. The answer referenced intelligence estimates prepared 48 hours earlier, still citing positions now known to be obsolete. Hitler demanded confirmation. None could be provided. The intelligence chief attempted to explain the lag in reporting, citing disrupted communications and enemy speed. The explanation failed to satisfy. The gap between expectation and reality had become too wide. By 0945, the tone shifted. Hitler accused the intelligence staff of deception, not error. He insisted that certainty had been promised, that the enemy had been described as constrained, predictable, and exhausted. He pointed to the map, tapping a sector now reported lost, and asked how could an army appear where it was not supposed to exist. No one answered directly. The silence was interpreted as evasion.
At 0105 hours, Hitler ordered a detailed accounting of enemy movements over the previous 72 hours. The request exposed the limits of the system. Reports were fragmented, time-stamped inconsistently, and often contradictory. The intelligence chief admitted that the enemy's operational tempo had exceeded established tracking methods. The admission was factual, but it carried an implicit acknowledgement of failure. By 10:30, Hitler's anger focused inward. He accused senior commanders of relying too heavily on assumptions and doctrine. He cited previous warnings about enemy deception and accused the staff of complacency. The room grew tense. Several officers avoided eye contact. Responsibility was diffuse, but the demand for accountability was immediate. At 1100 hours, Hitler demanded immediate countermeasures. He ordered reserves to be committed to restore the situation, naming formations already depleted or mispositioned. Staff officers attempted to explain fuel shortages, road congestion, and air superiority constraints. Each explanation was met with dismissal. The orders were issued regardless, written down and transmitted with the expectation of compliance. By 1135 hours, a partial withdrawal order was issued to several formations simultaneously. The order lacked synchronization. Units began moving at different times and along different routes. Some encountered enemy forces immediately. Others found their routes blocked by friendly units retreating from elsewhere. The confusion generated additional reports, further cluttering the information flow. By 1430 hours, the intelligence section acknowledged that its tracking methods had failed to keep pace with the enemy. The admission was internal and did not alter external reporting. The recognition came too late to restore coherence. The battlefield had fragmented into disconnected engagements. At 1530, a junior officer suggested abandoning map-based tracking in favor of sector-based reporting, focusing on loss of territory rather than precise positions. The suggestion was noted but not adopted. Changing methodology mid-crisis was deemed too risky. The irony was not lost on those present. By 1700, orders issued in the morning were no longer relevant. Units continued to request guidance that could not be provided with confidence. The chain of command remained intact in form, but hollow in function. Authority depended on information, and information was unreliable. At 1800, the commanding general authorized a consolidation north of the Seine, acknowledging that intermediate positions could not be held coherently. The order represented a strategic contraction forced by operational confusion. The cost was immediate: abandoned equipment, isolated units, and exposed rear areas. As evening approached, the maps lay flat but meaningless. They no longer represented a battlefield that could be controlled or even clearly described. The erosion of situational awareness had translated into irreversible loss of initiative. The battlefield did not merely defy understanding, it punished the attempt to impose it. 13 August 1944. At 0915 hours, the situation briefing began at the Führer headquarters with the reading of a summary already known to be incomplete. The conference room was sealed, its heavy doors closed against the summer heat. The maps on the wall were smaller than those used at the front, simplified for presentation, their clarity dependent entirely on the accuracy of reports filtered upward. Hitler listened without interruption as the operations officer outlined the southern situation in cautious terms. The language was measured, hedged, and behind the pace of events. At 0932, Hitler interrupted. He asked where the enemy's main armored forces were located. The answer referenced intelligence estimates prepared
48 hours earlier, still citing positions now known to be obsolete. Hitler demanded confirmation. None could be provided. The intelligence chief attempted to explain the lag in reporting, citing disrupted communications and enemy speed. The explanation failed to satisfy. The gap between expectation and reality had become too wide. By 0945, the tone shifted. Hitler accused the intelligence staff of deception, not error. He insisted that certainty had been promised, that the enemy had been described as constrained, predictable, and exhausted.
He pointed to the map, tapping a sector now reported lost, and asked how an army could appear where it was not supposed to exist. No one answered directly. The silence was interpreted as evasion. At 10:05, Hitler ordered a detailed accounting of enemy movements over the previous 72 hours. The request exposed the limits of the system. Reports were fragmented, time-stamped inconsistently, and often contradictory. The intelligence chief admitted that the enemy's operational tempo had exceeded established tracking methods. The admission was factual, but it carried an implicit acknowledgement of failure. By 10:30, Hitler's anger focused inward. He accused senior commanders of relying too heavily on assumptions and doctrine. He cited previous warnings about enemy deception and accused the staff of complacency. The room grew tense. Several officers avoided eye contact. Responsibility was diffuse, but the demand for accountability was immediate. At 10:00, Hitler demanded immediate countermeasures. He ordered reserves to be committed to restore the situation, naming formations already depleted or mispositioned. Staff officers attempted to explain fuel shortages, road congestion, and air superiority constraints. Each explanation was met with dismissal. The orders were issued regardless, written down and transmitted with the expectation of compliance. By 10:35, a senior operations officer quietly noted that the ordered movements were no longer feasible. The enemy had already cut key routes. The officer framed the objection as a logistical concern rather than defiance. Hitler rejected it outright, accusing the officer of defeatism. The distinction between realism and disloyalty collapsed. At 1200, a revised intelligence estimate was presented, acknowledging that Patton's forces had executed a rapid exploitation beyond anticipated limits, using secondary routes and accepting logistical risk. The estimate concluded that the enemy had deliberately masked his movement, exploiting German reliance on conventional indicators. Hitler seized on the conclusion. The deception, he argued, was not accidental, it was systemic. By 1230, Hitler's realization hardened. He recognized that the enemy had not merely advanced faster, but had undermined the German command structure's ability to perceive movement. The reliance on orderly reports, predictable timelines, and doctrinal constraints had been used against them. The enemy's proximity, once dismissed, had been constant. The failure was one of perception. At 1200, Hitler issued a directive forbidding further withdrawals without explicit authorization. The order was absolute, detached from conditions at the front. It aimed to reassert control through rigidity. The staff understood the implication. Delay or disobedience would carry personal consequence. The directive was transmitted verbatim. By 10:35, reports arrived indicating that units ordered to counterattack were unable to assemble. Some were already engaged, others lacked fuel. The reports were summarized and withheld from immediate presentation. The decision to delay informing Hitler reflected a growing fear of provoking further outbursts. Information management replaced information flow. At 1430, Hitler demanded an update. The delayed reports were presented in abbreviated form. He accused the staff of sabotage, insisting that the enemy's success was aided by internal weakness. The accusation was not rhetorical. It carried the threat of reprisal. The atmosphere in the room shifted from analytical to defensive. By 1500, the consequences of earlier orders became visible. Units committed piecemeal suffered losses without achieving cohesion. Attempts to regain initiative failed. The enemy continued to advance, exploiting gaps faster than orders could be revised. The system responded by issuing more orders, each less connected to reality than the last. At 1600, Hitler withdrew from the conference abruptly. No concluding guidance was given beyond reiteration of existing directives. The staff remained, uncertain how to reconcile orders with conditions. The absence of adaptive authority at the top froze initiative below. Compliance became procedural rather than effective. By evening, at 1830, the operational picture had deteriorated further. Reports confirmed that multiple formations were at risk of encirclement. Requests for withdrawal authority accumulated unanswered. The directive against retreat held. The cost of obedience was now measurable in lost units and abandoned equipment. The realization had come too late. The enemy had been closer than believed, faster than anticipated, and more willing to exploit disorder than doctrine allowed. The system designed to impose control had been outpaced and outplayed. The response, rigid and accusatory, deepened the collapse it sought to prevent. The consequence was irreversible. Initiative lost, authority hollowed, and the enemy dictating events beyond the reach of command.